Understanding agency decision making. So understanding agency decision making first really requires us to understand the environment in which state agencies make decisions, right? And we focus on decision making because that is the point often where scientific information and scientific research and researchers themselves, right, are often coming into that space, right? Most of you, if not all of you, don't just want to engage with state agencies because you just for the joy of sharing knowledge. Most of you have some sort of goal, right? To influence the decision making, right, of an agency. And so to do so, first, as if you were following along with the previous section, are going to understand like is complex and really requires this sort of systems view. So that includes understanding time. Decisions often need to land in days or weeks, not months, not years, not within a 5-year grant period, right? And so you have to show up with the information that is available in that context. And that often means not running new models, not collecting data, right? Not um, sort of the sense of like, oh, we don't know enough, but instead, what do we know and what can we safely extrapolate from what we know to be able to support in better decision making? It's not perfect decision making, better decision making. And the biggest risk is if you get a reputation as a scientist of letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, and you come in and yes, you've got good things to say, but then you're kind of throwing a fit because it's not perfect and you're picking apart what exists instead of thinking about how it can make a even slightly incrementally better decision for the agency or help the agency make that incrementally better decision, then you will quickly lose your credibility as a partner that is worth taking the meeting and spending time with. Authority. So, authority really refers to the statutes, regulations, and leadership direction that bounds a state agency's ability to act, right? So that's statutory authority, regulatory authority, right? These are the powers given by the state constitution, by their governor's office, by legislation in the legislature, or some other statute that's on the books. And it's really important to understand to a degree, not every statute. You don't need to walk in the room being able to quote and cite statute and regulation, but there will be in your for the substantive domain that you work in key statutes and regulations that really matter. And if you're coming from one state to another, those statutes and that regulatory environment can look dramatically different. And it plays out in the culture and decision environment of that agency. Third, thinking about risk, right? It's always important. And many, of course, researchers and scientists and faculty don't ever get involved and never engage with policy committees because they're afraid of the risk, the political backlash, the legal challenges, or implementation failures that an agency could get embroiled in are something that could blow back on you. And that risk can be really scary, right? But there are ways to manage that risk and ways to understand where that risk is. And there's resources here as well as other resources that we provide that can facilitate sort of navigating that. And again, like this really speaks to the idea of a systems navigation exercise is what engagement with state agencies in this sort of policy space is. So you need to understand what are the political kind of landmines, if you will, both through the executive, right, with the governor's office, as well as through the legislative context, and maybe to a lesser extent, but still very relevant, is in judicial context as well. And also, like, what is the sort of current, norms and mood of your state, right? For those of you who may work in child welfare settings, like if there's been a recent scandal of some sort or a child that's been harmed and there was a miss through some of the child welfare services or something like that, we've seen that really embroil the entire decision environment and it really bogs things down. So not only do you need to know it to protect yourself, you need to know it because if you're coming into an agency and you're blind to like their agency has been caught up in some sort of issue or legal challenge, or something has happened with that state agency over the last few months and you're not aware of it, it looks really tone deaf, right? And you wouldn't like it if someone came into your environments and your spaces trying to tell you what to do, and they didn't even know what was going on. And it's a quick way to get discounted. And this is can be achieved through a quick, you know, search, like news search of just the agency, right? And trying to understand like what's happened in that context. So treat these constraints as design parameters, if you will, right? For those of you who work in design spaces, or those of you who think about modeling, right? Where time, timely scoped evidence, right? It can build the key empathy, trust, and decision impact that you're hoping to have. But being out of touch, not recognizing timeliness, not understanding authority, not being aware of the risks, and importantly, not understanding capacity of staff time and analytic support, and how limited those can be. And we talked about that. We've talked about that in the previous section. Becomes really difficult. So what this means for you as a researcher, at the point of decision making with state agencies, so different criteria are going to rise to the top. Relevance often matters more than precision. Decision makers need information that directly applies to their context, and you ignore that at your peril, right? It is better to bring quasi-experimental work forward that speaks to the real needs of the state than something that is totally unrelated but may have a stronger experimental design, for instance. Often, state agencies will prioritize science that was done, right, and research that was done in the state on state populations a lot more than they're going to prioritize research that was done in a totally different state context, right? State agencies, through their lens, the staff and leadership, right, they see the state as a very unique and nuanced environment, right? And translating things from state to state is possible, but requires meaningful assumptions, right, for them, and is often more difficult to wade through than if you could say, yes, we did this in this state, or this has been replicated in this state. That becomes really important. So timeliness matters also more than completeness, as late evidence is going to be unusable structurally, right, regardless of quality. But feasibility is also going to matter more than innovation. And that's another kind of key element for folks to understand, is that you can have the coolest, most amazing bells and whistles solution, right? It can be the most rigorously evaluated, but if it's not feasible because of resources, because of logistics, because of the political environment, because they lack statutory authority to put these things into place, it doesn't mean very much to that agency. They'll say, that's amazing, and I wish the environment, that we operated on would allow for this, but ignoring the feasibility of things and the implementation capacity is going to be something that's going to really get in the way of productive conversations. This, of course, does not mean that rigor is unimportant, but it does mean that rigor alone is insufficient. Researchers who really understand that sometimes you have to make strategic choices about what you emphasize, right? So, for example, we often talk about offering a clear range of expected impacts instead of a detailed in the weeds statistical model. They don't care, right, about the elements for the most part of the models that you run, right, or the nuances of those models. They're depending upon you and viewing your science through how much they trust you. If it's the first time they've ever met you, right, they might want more information, but the information they want is not how the parameters of your model per se. It's how much do you trust this model? Has this model been effective? Has findings using this model been effectively applied in other contexts, right? And that's something that is extremely important, is starting to understand, like, it's not just you understanding things on the ground, but everything you say is seen and deemed credible or not through who you are as a person and who you're kind of presenting yourself as. And that's something that is tricky and we'll get into in a later section. Further, recognizing these priorities helps researchers position their work as supportive rather than burdensome, and it really encourages these proactive environments. So, briefs prepared ahead of known decision cycles, right, is so valuable. If you know, right, that budget season's coming up, or a regulatory analysis is about to happen, or there's some sort of program inventory that's about to occur, get ready for it. Prepare those materials and those insights ahead of time so that you can not only be part of the conversation, but you can be the most prepared person at the table. And that's where researchers can really shine, is that we often can be the most prepared and most thorough, long as we have the time to get those things together. But that means that you have to be ready and understand sort of the cycles of decision making. Ultimately, we find that by bridging the gap between best available evidence and most usable evidence, researchers can ultimately play an effective role in supporting public decision making. And this is another element that we'll emphasize more later, but the idea here is not a one and done. The idea is you're building a relationship, and that you are going to provide the evidence that's available today, but you're going to do so in a way that when better evidence comes tomorrow, or more relevant evidence comes tomorrow, that you can get that to them, and that they'll open the email, they'll take the meeting, they'll read the brief, right? As opposed to it going off into the ether and never making a difference. So, as mentioned, evidence doesn't win by default. So, it's a common assumption that strong evidence will naturally influence decisions. In practice, evidence competes with budget constraints, political priorities, legal limitations, operational feasibility. Decision makers rarely choose between evidence and no evidence, they choose among options with different implications. If your evidence that you're bringing forward isn't positioned to address the trade-offs of choosing this over choosing that, it's unlikely that you're really going to inform the decision-making process, because it really leads researchers to focus on it showcases that you're a researcher that's focused on methods over usability, right? And so the key here is to show up and understand, if you're recommending a pathway or even just a focus on a population, what are they giving up, right? Because their time is finite, their resources are finite. And so what do they give up to follow the advice that you've given? Further, recognizing that evidence does not win by default is really a critical mindset shift, right? In a similar fashion that we want you to really understand that systems navigation is the name of the game, right? Understanding that evidence is not going to be the trump card, if you will, right? That it really can be most useful for encouraging strategic framing, but evidence as a tool, and evidence can be a tool that clarifies choices within a broader decision narrative, but it doesn't necessarily um, beat out the political and the statutory and all of these other concerns. And but what can be really helpful is it does provide an avenue to bring complexity and increase credibility of decision making. So you'll find many state agencies, they want to use scientific evidence, they want to lean on it, but they feel like that the right scientific evidence isn't available, right? And that's true to some extent. And sometimes they just don't know about it, and that's where your engagement with state agencies can be so effective. But also, it can just fail to be specified in the right way. We as researchers have a tendency to ask questions that are of most interest to the journals we're trying to publish in, as opposed to the state agencies that we really should try to serve. All right, so let's talk about some of the skills. So, this one of the key skills that we want you to start thinking about, and we can talk a little bit about how you develop, is this idea of diagnosing the decision context. So, you need to clarify what the decision is that you are hoping gets made, as well as the decision maker who's actually able to make it. So, identifying what decision is being made and who owns it, and what are the constraints that shape those options, right? How high do you have to go that they have the statutory authority, that it aligns with leadership priorities, they have the resources to be able to act. The second element of diagnosing the decision context, where you can develop this as a skill, is increasingly developing an understanding and even some intuition around timing and information needs. You can do this systematically and quantitatively, even where you map the sort of action timeline, right? And then tailor your evidence to that. So understanding what is useful now versus later. So you can have that high quality research at the right time. But the most important thing is really understanding how cycles move, right? Because things are cyclical within government, right? There's the budget year, there's election cycles, there's the statutory reviews and new regulatory processes that come into play, things that cycle on and cycle off, the legislative calendar. Understanding those big things can help you understand the timing because there's just certain times of the year that it makes no sense to approach, right? And this probably is not a surprise to many of you, but like showing up, a couple days before Thanksgiving is not a particularly productive time, right, to be engaging with state agencies unless there is some sort of other external situation that has created a policy window. But so it's unlikely that they're going to need things right that day. They're not going to need things, over the winter holidays generally, but sometimes they do, right? And understanding what is likely to be needed becomes important, right? Summer recesses for legislative context, that's also really important, right? Understanding when people are going to be in town and when they're not, because when the legislature isn't in town, sometimes that means agencies have more bandwidth for creativity. Sometimes, when the legislature is in the middle of budget season and developing the budget, that those state agencies, everything else has to stop. So they're available for questions and things like that. And then, most importantly, and the skill that all of you are probably best oriented to develop, but also have to practice if this is new to you, is asking targeted questions and listening, right? So specific questions, not leading questions per se, but questions to get the information you need and then really listening to what they're saying. That means taking careful notes. Many state agencies are more comfortable, for instance, with AI notes and things like that. So you can use those type of things. And if possible, bring someone else along, right? Because if you're focused on the conversation, you may not be as focused on being able to listen. So having someone else, whether it's by recording it and watching it later, or come along with you to the meeting, whether it's in person or online, to really listen to what they're saying, not what you think they're saying, not what you want them to say, but really determining what those agency needs are, right? So you can think of this as a needs assessment often. Um, and then if you're able to engage in kind of active listening kind of processes, then use those tools, right? In active listening where you acknowledge what has been said, you celebrate, right? And provide gratitude and thankfulness for them willing to share certain information, especially if that information is not public, right? And really showing that you are seeking to build a proactive and trusted partnership, right? And you're not just trying to get through the meeting, you're not just trying to get them to agree to this one thing. You're presenting yourself as a resource, right? And a resource who genuinely cares about their mission and their goals and wants to understand those fully and completely as possible.